Jürgen Habermas's Reconstruction of Historical Materialism by Helmut Reichelt. If one wishes to differentiate Habermas's theory from that of Marx in terms of its central motifs, then one will have to argue along the following lines. From the very beginning, even his doctoral thesis on Democritus and Epicurus' natural philosophy, Marx pursued a program of deciphering society as an organic form of increasing individualization. Marx's focus is on forms. At first on forms of consciousness, such as religion, philosophy, morality, and law, and later on forms or categories of political economy. For Marx, the focus on forms was identical with the critique of the inverted forms of social existence, an existence constituted by the life practice of human beings. All these forms obtain as inverted form of a community that is external to the individuals and from which they must emancipate themselves in order ever to be able to interact with one another as individuals. This central idea is presented in its most pregnant form in the German ideology. The reality that communism creates is precisely the real basis for rendering it impossible, that any reality should exist independently of individuals, insofar as this reality is only a product of the preceding intercourse of the individuals themselves. It is thus a matter of deciphering theoretically the appearance of independence that this surrogate of community posits, and then of expelling it practically from the world so that human beings will be able to enter into relationship with one another, not as character mask, but as real individuals. Marx sees this new figure of society anticipated in the community of revolutionary proletarians who extend their own control over the conditions of their own existence and those of all members of society. It is as individuals that the individuals participate in it. It is exactly this combination of individuals, assuming an advanced stage of modern productive forces, of course, which puts the conditions of the free development and movement of individuals under their control. Conditions which were previously abandoned to chance, and had one independent existence over and against the separate individuals, precisely because of their separation as individuals. His early conceptualizations, and in particular the discussion of alienated labor, the alienation from the species being, etc., always express this one central idea. They are, to a certain extent, the counter-concept to the existing forms of an inverted society, including its forms of consciousness and surrogates of community. In the Jewish question, Marx presents it as follows. All emancipation is a return to the human world and human relationships to humans themselves. Political emancipation is the reduction of man, on the one hand, to a member of bourgeois society, an egoistic and independent individual, on the other hand, to a citizen of the state, a moral person. Not until the real individual man has taken the abstract citizen back into himself and, as an individual man, has become a species being as an empirical life, in his individual work and individual relationships, not until man recognizes and organizes his forces prospes as social forces, and thus no longer separates social forces from himself in the form of political forces, not until then will human emancipation be completed. That was a beautiful quote. Marx was not painting here a picture of a communist society, nor did he do so later. Communism means primarily the practical abolition of all these inverted forms of individualization, and therewith two of the surrogate forms of community, and it also means the creation of relationships in which human beings can interact socially with one another as individuals. What such a society might look like in the detail would, he imagined, be decided by the human beings themselves. That's another great line. Turning now to Habermas, he begins with the same assumption that after the experiences of German fascism and the development of really existing socialism, thoughts such as these can no longer be reiterated without skepticism and relativization. Habermas notoriously circumvents the question whether Marx's thematization of the forms of consciousness or of the forms of value, that is to say, the categories of political economy, is not in itself significant, and that is regardless of the program of their practical or potential abolition. This was the dilemma of Adorno's and Horkheimer's critical theory. Although the potential subject of practical transformation ultimately disappeared entirely from the theory field of vision, both held onto the theory of an inverted social ability. This theory was primarily concerned with the genetic explication of society, and the society was understood as the totality of these inverted forms. And this critical theory agreed with the core idea of Marxist theory. The concept of totality is simply an Aesopian reformulation of Marx's conception of base and idealistic dialectic, from the German ideology Superstructures. How then does Habermas come to terms with these forms? It is within this context that we want to explicate his reconstruction of historical materialism. What is meant by reconstruction? In the introduction to his book on the reconstruction of historical materialism, Habermas defines his intentions in the following way. Reconstruction means that one takes apart a theory and reassembles it in a new form in order once again to achieve the goal that it had set for itself. One can certainly approve of this formulation, yet it remains merely formal. What were the goals that Marx set for himself? More precisely, what were the goals that in Habermas's interpretation Marx set for himself? Habermas expressed himself emphatically on this matter a few years later. If one reads Marx correctly, one can see that the embodied in the institutions of bourgeois states are ideas belonging to the inheritance which deserves to be preserved in a social society. This inheritance is what Habermas is interested in, and we may consider his work as a full-scale attempt to determine this inheritance in precise terms and to be present proposals for a rational political practice so that it remains viable. Habermas considers his work as a continuation, an updating of the old critical theory associated with Horkheimer and Adorno. He reapproaches the old critical theory for the failure to render intelligible the normative foundation of its critical standpoint, a failure which for Habermas is systematic because of its character as a critical theory, in relation to a liberated society and against the background of the predominance, of absolutizing of the concept of instrumental reason. This failure manifests itself in the claim to an expanded concept of reason, which it cannot explicate and validate. According to Habermas, Marx can be reproached for the same deficiencies. Habermas argues that Marx attached himself to the idea of the Enlightenment, and he saw these embodied in the institutions of the bourgeois state. Habermas argues that Marx was unable to demonstrate how moral categories were built into the judicial and political institutions. This then led to the result that in his theory of historical materialism, Marx was forced to render the concept of production absolute. Habermas early differentiated between labor and interaction has to be seen against this background. This differentiation is of utmost importance for his work. It functions as a kind of theoretical resolution which remained a determinant factor in the latter construction of his theory. Base and superstructure versus developmental dynamic and developmental logic, the Starnberger dispute with Marxism. In order to unravel Habermas's reconstruction of historical materialism, it is instructive to refer to his early essay, Reflections on the Evolutionary Status of Modern Law. Here, Habermas introduces the theoretical direction and thrust of his work. In this short treatise, he uses verbatim the term legal form, that is, Habermas connects directly onto Marx's program. How then does Habermas read built-in moral categories out of the legal form? The text originated in the context of his reconstruction of historical materialism, where he tried to formulate his position in the explicit opposition to Marxist ideas, which he then characterized rather frostily as enormously popular attempts to derive the juridical and political forms of the capital state from the form of economic intercourse, and ultimately from that of the commodity. Attempts which he considers misdirected. Well, what else would you do it from, I'm wondering? It may be supposed that Habermas is dealing with the rather unmeticulously developed analytical accounts of J. Hirsch and D. Lapel, to whom he refers to here as representatives of the Marxist derivations of the state. Nevertheless, the question naturally arises as to the validity of Habermas's criticism of the program itself. For Habermas is not at all interested in deriving the legal form and the form of the state. Rather, he is interested in examining the already existing, that is, constituted form, and this with a view to discerning whether reason is embodied in it. He seeks using a characteristic formulation from his theory of communicated action to decipher reason in the existing forms. Accordingly, Habermas distinguishes between the form and the content of law. Here, with regard to the content of modern law, his position accords with the traditional Marxist positions. Quote, the contents of private law are determined first of all by the needs of capital's economic interaction. Its core is the institutional guarantee of property with the concomitant guarantee of the contract freedom and rights to trade and inheritance. The contents of constitutional law are tailored to a state that's supported by a large decentralized administrative apparatus based on technical expertise and the division of labor guarantees the conditions for the continued existence of a private economic order without itself having to take on functions of production. The subjectively public laws mirrors the functional specification of state power vis-a-vis a private autonomous economic interaction. Carried out from these viewpoints, a functional analysis of the most important legal forms would be able to demonstrate how the law contributes to the systematic rationality of society. Systematic rationality, however, is a viewpoint that interests Habermas only in terms of the developmental dynamic, and this is where Habermas's analysis parallels those of Hirsch and Lepel. The capitalist mode of reduction is of course decisive for the developmental dynamic that explains the content and functions of civil law. Nonetheless, the viewpoint itself should not be mistaken for an analysis of the modern legal form. But how does Habermas conceive of forms? Given his objective, one must expect that he would direct his attention to the legal form, for when the content proves to be the condition by capitalist development, then reason can inhere only in the form. Viewed in terms of a developmental logic, the form of modern law can be conceived as an embodiment of post-conventional structures of consciousness. Habermas assumes, and here he relies on Piaget and Kohlberg, that the post-conventional form of consciousness is logically no longer surpassable. In short, for Habermas, a free and reasonable society can only be built on the already existing forms of reason, and modern law embodies in this reason. It is primarily in the context that we must analyze this entire formal analysis of modern law. How then is rationality subsumed in modern law, as a dialectician would say, or embodied in it, as Habermas says? Since for Habermas, all rationality ultimately discloses itself as discursive, it is only under this aspect that legal norms can be deciphered as rational. The rationality of norms measures itself immediately according to problems of justification that are to be overcome discursively in an immediated manner according to whether the institutional preconditions for the thematization of validity claims for recognition for an argumentative test are given. The object of the test is the question as to whether a problematic norm can express interests capable of being generalized or compromised, such as values, such they would be accepted and preferred over known alternatives by those who might be affected by them if they were to participate in a practical discourse. Although Habermas had not yet completely formulated what later became a central discursive principle, this idea of his reconstruction already informs his conception of the rationality of legal norms and directs the conceptualization of modern law. For this reason, Habermas speaks quite cautiously in the subjunctive whether he emphasizes the characteristic features of modern law in terms of an embodiment of rationality. The rationality of the law may be recognized in the fact that it is tailored to the strategic rationality of the purposively acting subject. This tailoring is visible not in its legal materials, but in its structural features, in positivity, in legalism, and in the formality of the law. Insofar as Habermas bases the deciphering of rationality on these structural features, he remains within Marxist theoretical framework. For all these structural features define a system of action in which it is assumed that all members of the system behave strategically, in that they 1. Obey laws as officially sanctioned, but all times legitimately alterable conventions, 2. Pursue their interests without moral considerations, and 3. Make optimal decisions according to their interest orientations within the bounds of valid laws. It is assumed, in other words, that they purposive rational use of their private autonomy. Regarding these three structural features, the difference from Marx has less to do with the fact that Habermas sees the law as a functional complement to economic calculating activity. Rather, it has to do with his conviction that modern law cannot be derived from the forms of economic interaction, nor ultimately from the commodity form, but that it is in fact the other way around. It is only on the basis of legal form that capitalist systematic rationality can develop. The first named structural features of modern law, conventionality, legality, formality, are general determinations of a legally binding institutionalization of well-defined fields of strategic action. They make explicit the form on the basis of which modern law can fulfill the functional imperative of a market-regulated economic interaction. But this systematic rationality results from legal structures in which purposive rational activity can become generalized. Formulations such as these are quite bewildering and, like Weber's Protestantism thesis, nourish the suspicion that a new monocausality is to be introduced to oppose Marxist theory. Habermas, however, wants something different. System and life are conceived as distinct forms of integration, and neither can be reduced to the other. Each obeys its own distinct logic, the life world a logic of development that cannot be attributed to systematic rationality. Systemic rationality does not explain how these legal structures are possible. Observed in terms of developmental logic, the form of modern law can be conceived as an embodiment of post-conventional structures of consciousness. At this point, Habermas argues cautiously in the subjunctive, as if he were still unsure. In any case, his ideas about the legal form remain programmatic in this period. The relationship between modern law and capitalist development is of no importance to Habermas. Rather, what is decisive for him is the conceptual distinction between life world and system. His entire palace of ideas would collapse like a house of cards if it were possible to trace modern law in the specific form back to the structure of the socio-economic base. It would then no longer be possible to postulate the discursive reason is as constitutive of the human linguistic community as it is of modern law, nor to interpret these institutions of the modern constitutional state and of parliamentary democracy as partial embodiments of reason, least of all, as he has had, of a universally conceived reason. The capitalist mode of production is of course decisive for the developmental dynamic that explicates these contents and functions of civil law, but not the developmental logic which alone explicates the forms and structure of rationality of civil law. For Habermas, the study of Piaget and Kohlberg appeared to supply sufficient insights to justify the notion that there is a distinctive logical property in moral development. This logic, he argues, can also be invoked for the reconstruction of the form of modern law. The conventionalism, legalization, and formalization of the law mean that it can no longer sustain itself on the unquestioned authority of moral traditions, but requires an autonomous foundation. Only in the post-conventional stage can the moral consciousness satisfy such a demand. Only there originates the idea that legal norms are fundamentally criticizable and require justification. Only here do we find the distinction between norms of action and principles of action, the concept of a principle-directed production of norms, and the notions of the rational unification of norms. Although the title of the study reads Towards the Reconstruction of Historical Materialism, Habermas' real goal is the reconstruction of the structures of rationality. These structures can be found in modern law. For this reason, the entire explication of the forms of modern law must up to this point remain unsatisfying because the decisive aspects, the structure of rationality, has yet to be thematized. The previous considerations should support the thesis that the rationality of the law in modern society can adequately be analyzed, neither from the viewpoint of a growing systematic rationality, nor from the viewpoint of an improved internal systematization of legal propositions, but rather only from the viewpoint of the enforcement of strategic rationality in the interaction of private subjects with one another, but these do not go far enough. Habermas indeed wants to reconstruct how, in the evolution of law, discursive rationality is realized in the complex relationship between developmental logic and developmental dynamics. The other, above-mentioned structural characteristics are for Habermas unthinkable without this constitutive reason upon which the specific rationality of the norms rest. The increasing rationality of modern law is measured according to the rationality of its norms. Habermas has considered problems and is detecting the specific rationality of norms immediately in existing law. His point of reference has of course been the generality of norms. I have yet to mention a fourth structural characteristic of modern law: generality. According to its own claim, modern law should consist of general norms that fundamentally exclude all exceptions and privileges. The discussion that has been carried on since the 1920s about extra-constitutional regulatory measures, about the difficulty of formally separating, from the viewpoint of generality, administrative acts and laws when lawgivers must regulate increasingly concrete matters, is a symptom that these structural characteristics is to be perceived as essential. It is immediately linked to the legitimacy of bourgeois law. If and insofar as modern law universally regulates an area of strategic action, can the legal system as a whole be justified as an expression of generalizable interest? In the above quote, we find in a nutshell not only the core of Habermas's construction, but also what is problematic about it. That he refers to legal theoretical discussions about as a symptom of is itself symptomatic. He correctly surmises that the legal theorists view the structural characteristic of generality as essential because it is connected to the legitimacy of the law. But how is it linked to modern legitimacy? Is it, as he imputed to the legal theorists, because the form of generality itself, to which they so stubbornly cling, must be deciphered as the embodiment of discursive reason? Or is it merely the universal regulation, which as such sufficient to justify the legal system as a whole and is an expression of generalized interest? These are not the same. The former would be a form-genetic explication. The latter, the more or less lucid linkage of the legal norms with modern forms of legitimization. One can never be certain whether this linkage is perceived as a matter of discursive rationality or rationalization. Especially, his talk about the justification of the legal system as a whole gives rise to the suspicion that Habermas, despite all his expressly announced intentions, presents a construction in which rationality and rationalization have entered into a difficult marriage. Habermas stubbornly, repeatedly disputes with Weber's conception of legitimacy within the context of a theory of power, can be interpreted as a symptomatic. Habermas, it seems, has constantly to persuade himself that only rational argumentation can be the basis of modern legitimation and not a belief in legitimacy. His dispute with the Marxist critique of bourgeois law is characteristic in this context. Habermas starts with the assumption that this critique can prove the generality of the legal norm is in many cases guaranteed only in a word and form, but not with regard to its actual consequences. Yet at the same time, he counters that this critique is nourished by the claim that is itself bound up with the abstract law. What matters to Habermas is to explicate precisely that claim itself, and on the basis to legitimize modern law as precisely... I lost my place. But what matters to Habermas is to explicate precisely that claim itself, and on the basis to legitimize modern law as a rational foundation for the organization of state and society. Precisely herein, and Habermas does not want to ally himself with this rational tradition, consists indeed the historical accomplishment of rational natural law from Hobbes to Hegel. It is unclear which Marxist critique Habermas refers to here. It is doubtful whether the Marxist critique exists in the comprehensive collective singular, but his choice of words is revealing whom he speaks of the many cases in which the generality of the legal norm is guaranteed only in terms of this form and not with regard to the consequences, as if the latter were an avoidable accident. He fails to appreciate the fact that we are dealing here with the structural contradictions that exist in and through the generality of the legal norm itself, and that is the reality of the legal norm, its real validity and efficacy. As Hegel might have speculatively characterized it, the valid abstract law is the effective injustice. It is thus not a matter of proving this in many cases, but of showing that this contradiction is built into the structure of abstract law itself. To this extent, Habermas, against his own intention, hit the nail on the head when he argues that the historical accomplishment from Hobbes to Hegel has been the explication of the claim of abstract law, but it should be noted only the claim. Habermas reproaches Marxist theories of the state for their apparent functionalist analysis of the legal system. Such an analysis, Habermas argues, serves only to accuse, not to suspend, the unredeemed normative claim's validity. In fact, Marxism's critique of ideology confronts the normative implication of abstract law with the reality of the law itself. We will have to come back to the question how far Habermas's own conclusions are to be trusted. The functionalistically overextended notion that the normative claims to validity let themselves in a systematic theoretical manner not only be analyzed but also absorbed inside the consciousness of the members of society without notable consequences for the existence of the legal system is something that I had considered a social science fiction, indeed a fiction that without transposition into other anthropological grounds can hardly become the reality. That's from Habermas. This passage requires interpretation. Habermas in no way attributes to Marxist totalitarian ideas regarding the yet-to-be-produced society. Nonetheless, he demands sociological realism, the immediate realization of the ideas that the Enlightenment, liberty, equality, fraternity, reason, that is, the notion that all human beings should be able to act immediately in their everyday practice in a moral way, would indeed mean the dissolution of the separation between morality and law. Law would then be immediately moral, meaning that it would no longer exist. Such conceptions belong, there is no doubt, to the realm of social science fiction, a dystopia. Let us take stock in its reconstruction of historical materialism. Habermas is in considerable agreement with the Marxist theory. Modern law is explicitly, in terms of its contents, proven to be functional for the systematic rationality of capitalism. As far as the form is concerned, the three structural characteristics, conventionality, legality, and formality, show that modern law is based on the legally binding institutionalization of strategic action, and this means that the forms too is functional regarding the rationality of the system. Diverging from the Marxian program, Habermas assumes that modern law becomes possible only at post-conventional stages of moral development. This stage can itself not be derived from systematic rationality. In fact, it is this moral development that renders possible the universalization of capitalism. Habermas conceives this double-tracked argument, the division into developmental logic and developmental dynamic in the system and life world, because he wishes to postulate, on the one hand, that the three characteristics of modern law make the form explicit, and that it is on the basis that it can fulfill the functional imperative of an economic intercourse regulated through the market. On the other hand, these three characteristics are simultaneously to be described as an embodiment of post-conventional structures of consciousness. This embodiment entails discursive rationality, and it is therefore constitutive for the universal form of the legal norm. It is this generality of the form that is associated with the rational legitimation of modern law. And this is precisely because discursive rationality has permeated it in a form-determining way. The rationality of legal norms must thus be traced back to the discursive rationality. Claims that are connected with the universal form of the law should lead back to its origin, and that is to discursive rationality. Although modern law for Habermas proves itself to be functional for the systematic rationality of capitalism, it is because of its norm rationality, not only its function. It is more than that, because post-conventional structures of rationality are embodied in its form, it conceals a rationality one cannot without if society is to be changed. In contrast to Marxian theory, which would insist on a form-genetic explication of modern law as surrogate for community based on the alienated social individual, Habermas wants to trace modern law to a universally conceived practical reason that created a law that has indeed fulfilled the functional imperatives of capitalist economic interaction. However, because the form of law is impregnated with reason, it is equally well suited as a means of opposing the systematic rationality of capitalism, and thus of making possible a society in which those ideas that a correctly read Marx perceived in the institutions of the bourgeois state can realistically be achieved. This also means that human beings do not need to be transposed onto a new anthropological basis, and in addition, the existence of the legal system itself will be safeguarded. Habermas' theoretical construction moves within these coordinates and will its entire late work be deciphered. In the interview cited above, Habermas talks about the basic tenets of his theory of communicative action. He mentions not only the deficits of the old critical theory and of Marxian theory, but also a further, then still vibrant political issue. Namely, the bad abstract alternative between uptight neoconservatism and the anti-growth young conservatives. The one group would, at almost any price, in any case rather violently, to hold on to the capitalist model of social rationalization. Problems for socially integrated areas of life that result from this kind of politics are then pushed back and forth between the media of money and power, but they are not resolved. The anti-growth counterposition, the Greens of that period, also concealed the danger of a post-structuralist renunciation of all forms of reason. Modern life worlds are differentiated and should also remain differentiated so that reflexivity and tradition, the individualization of socialized subjects, the universal foundations of law and morality don't go to the devil. We see that Habermas held firmly onto the basic ideas expressed in his reconstruction of historical materialism. Even though these are not present in any way that corresponds to the more developed state of his theory, the following section focuses on the development of his conceptual framework in his later work. System and life world. It has already been pointed out that Habermas made a decisive step in his theoretical development quite early on with the differentiation between labor and interaction. This step appears to have been motivated by what he perceived as a lack of practical political reason in the work of Marx and critical theory. However, Habermas's theoretical work did not develop in a straight line. As it is the case with Wittgenstein, one has to differentiate between Habermas 1 and Habermas 2. There is then a break in the elaboration of his theory, a new beginning. This new beginning originated with his turn towards linguistic theory, leading to the development of universal pragmatic conceptions and their connection to sociological inquiries. There is no doubt in my mind that Habermas has made huge advances in discourse theory and linguistic pragmatism. What is particularly noteworthy is his attempt to connect these areas of study with the theory of action. There is no doubt also that his accomplishments have not been appropriately recognized. That is so is a result of the persisting division of labor between the disciplines. Linguistic theory is too complex for the sociologist and the philosopher who do not want to occupy themselves with the sociological question, but it is not my intention to deal with this problem here. In the context of our inquiry, it is important to note that Habermas reformulated an important idea of Marx's theory, namely, individualization is a social process. Marx conceived this thought materialistically when he argued that the egoistic addiction of individuals, mediated through money, is characteristic for the individualization of the individual within society. For Marx, then, individualization is a necessary form of a system in which social labor obtains in a mode of being denied, such as private property. As an earlier quotation from Marx's early work has shown, Marx conceives the system of social labor as an inverted form of individualization, an optimalizing machine. Through which the social relations of production subsist. What Marx criticizes in bourgeois theory, and what he considers to be the central characteristic of the bourgeois character of the theory, is its presupposition of the individualized individual as an absolute, a false naturalistic syllogism, which is complemented by its inability to comprehend the categories of political economy. Bourgeois theory, in short, is blind. It does not see the social character and existence of what it celebrates as the individualized individual. Habermas does not deal with this issue at all, nor does he discuss this question whether the self-reflexivity of modern subjectivity and the category of individualization are possibly tied to the form of social relations. Rather, he extracts this dialectic of individual and society from its original context and thematizes it, exclusively within the framework of the now integrated linguistic and action theories. In short, the dialectic of individual and society becomes an intersubjectivity conceived theory of the life world. Habermas repeats Marx's critique of the absolutized concept of the subject in bourgeois theory as a whole. However, he does so on the basis of the life world, and his critique is targeted against the whole of modern philosophy, which stands accused of not having recognized that it poses as absolute its own position on the philosophy of consciousness, a position from which a theoretical reconstruction of the simultaneous genesis of individual and society is deemed to be impossible. Habermas never raises the question whether the absolutizing of the subject is the philosophy of consciousness could possibly indebted to the bourgeois relations of production. Instead, he belittles the category of the egoistic individual and deprives it of its critical content. He does so by detaching the individual, its history, and being from the relation of production. And by rendering it in an action-theoretical manner completely harmless, he signals with his conception of strategic action, which, to the help of his concept, he constructs the form of systemic integration, system, in distinction from the form of social integration, life world, which he conceives as something made up of linguistically coordinated action. Habermas distinguishes between the two types of rationality. One belongs to the context of strategic action and systemic integration. It is seen as a reduced type of rationality. It is the sort of purposeful rationality, or indeed strategic action, upon which the entire development of economic theory rests, and that is its exclusively instrumental character was absolutized as the only concept of reason by Max Weber in the Weber Marxism of the Frankfurt School. The second type refers to an expanded concept of reason, which according to Habermas was taken up by the critical theory in Marx, but which has never been developed in explicit terms. This expanded concept is located in the life world, a world where action is oriented towards understanding. It is this expanded concept of reason that provides the basis for the reconstruction of post-conventional psychonsciousness. With these types of action, understanding-oriented action and purpose proposes strategic action, Habermas constructs as two forms of integration, life world and system. Against this background, Habermas criticizes all of sociology and social theory as insufficiently complex because none appears to be adequate to the complexity that the object field presents. And he insists that we need to account both theoretically and methodologically for the intertwining of social integration and systemic integration. In short, he insists on the development of a concept of society as the unity of a life world and system. Of course, he argues that these two system and life world have to be combined within one another in a non-trivial manner. In his view, all previous theory emphasizes one or the other theoretical position, the hermeneutical or the scientific, and conceives of society either as a comprehensible, communicative, mediated context of action, or as a reified system. According to Habermas, both of these positions have to be brought together to create a unified theoretical concept. The original point of departure, labor interaction, has also been elaborated further. The postulated autonomy of the moral practical sphere, its irreducibility to categories of the production process, has been developed. In terms of the concept of the life world, the sphere that was previously registered under the category labor is now conceptualized with the help of Talcott Parsons' media theory, that is, the theory of subsystems. It is with the help of Parsons' media theory that historical materialism is to be reconstructed. Against the dialectic of the relations and forces of production, Habermas proposes the view that human history is an evolutionary process that is best understood as a complicated intertwining of developmental logic and developmental dynamic. He divides human history into three recognizable social formations: tribal society, the high cultures, and modernity. The first is distinguished by an immediate unity of life world and system. Exchange and power have yet to achieve autonomy through the establishment of their respective subsystems. The second type, pre-modern high cultures, is characterized by the evolution of an independent subsystem whose integration is based on the medium of power. In modernity, finally, we find the constitution of the economic as an independent system structure. The evolution towards modernity goes forward and is informed by the medium of money. Habermas' argument implies that the media operates as some sort of integrative mechanism that allows society to reproduce itself in an increasingly complex way. An abolition of power and money is unthinkable in this theory, for that would mean regressing to forms of social integration that are incompatible with the already attained forms of the rationalized life world. In Habermas' view, power and money are thus media that one cannot do without under any circumstances. According to him, Marx made the mistake of conceiving political economy as an inverted form of the life world, that is, not as a system, and that he therefore felt that after money and power could be abolished. In contradistinction to Marx, Habermas presumes that there is a need to distinguish between the levels of a systemic differentiation and the class-specific forms of its institutionalization. In other words, it is entirely conceivable that this evolutionary advantage integration level in the subsystems steered by the media of power and money could develop differently, with another life-worldly starting point, for example, with an ethic of brotherly love in the religious sphere. And it is conceivable that they could be transformed, without loss of complexity, to such an extent that the life world, as now colonized by power and money, would be decolonized. This would allow the life world to, once again, function according to its own proper mode of integration. This then is Habermas' version of a rational society. When Habermas criticizes and rejects Marx's historical materialism, he has a definite and indeed dogmatic version in mind. This version does not stand up to a critical reading of Capital. Of course, authors are permitted to change their point of view and to revise their work. One should therefore not speak of the historical materialism, but rather explicate Marx's conception of history against the background of his entire work. Because the critique of political economy stands at the center of Marx's work, it seems sensible to reconstruct his theory of evolution from this perspective. It makes little sense to focus merely on those passages where the materialist conception of history is explicitly summoned, as in the German ideology of 1845. Of course, in German ideology, Marx develops many themes that are central to his critique. The forces of production, in the forms of intercourse, and the contradictions between them, as well as the base and superstructure. But a naive reading will overlook the fact that Marx here presented an amalgam of several central theses from the work of Adam Smith, combined with his first attempt at a critique of political economy. Division of labor and accumulation are the central categories that, however, in this manner of the Paris manuscripts of 1845, are conceived as an inverted form of human species being. In this construction of its historical trajectory, the conceptualization carries more weight than it can bear, but a close reading of the German ideology reveals that Marx recognized only a single contradiction of this kind, namely that which obtains in the present and which manifests itself in repeated crises. In the Grundrisse, where he first supplied a dialectical development of his categories, Marx presents a different conceptualization. Marx is thinking here of a repeatedly occurring historical process that only under certain historical conditions could take the specific course that it did in Europe. About a year later, with the publication of Toward the Critique of Political Economy, Marx presented in the foreword a simplified version that later became the foundation of dogmatic historical materialism. It is thus this dogmatic reason that Marx that Habermas opposes when he presents his own theory of evolution. I do want to... Let's see, wait. Let me let's look at that real quick again. In the Grundrisse, he presents a different conception, but with Towards Critique of Political Economy, he had a simplified version. And that is what Habermas is criticizing. I'm a little confused by that, because why is it that this is a little confusing to me? I mean, maybe there's nothing to it, but why is that in the Grundrisse, Marx is not, like, being more open, more, properly dialectical? Then he gets simplified, and then Capital, and then volume 1 of Capital is neo-Ricardian, he doesn't go into the market, and then you gotta read, all of volume 3, and then it, stands up to the Grundrisse, I guess? I mean, or just as dialectical? But then there are people like Heinrich argue he isn't, so I don't know, it does seem like a confusing topic, to be honest. And literally people who study this for their whole life debate it, so I don't know, it's kind of confusing. There's probably a better answer to it. Anyways, the ambiguity in Marx's concept of history also sheds light on the concept of evolution. If Marx in the aforementioned foreword presented malgré lui, why don't you just speak English, man? A version of history that deviates from that of the Grundrisse, then it's necessary to consider that Marx had come to terms with the disappointment that the revolution he predicted for 1858 did not occur. Don't mean 1848 did not occur. In 1859, this dogmatic version amounted to a construction of necessity. While previous history had run according to this model, as an always renewed contradiction between the forces and relations of production, then Marx could also be sure that the transition to communist society, the last one, would likely succeed. The sequence of steps in the Habermas' evolutionary construction has an analogous function. Of course, he does not want to be assured of the practical overcoming of capitalist society. Actually, wait, let me interject here. Maybe that's the key to it. So, people criticize Lenin for being deterministic, but why is he? Because in his book on Karl Marx, where he summarizes all 3 volumes of Capital in just like a 1-hour read, it's pretty crazy that he did that. He says that the proletariat necessarily will overtake capitalism, and people criticize him for not being dialectical, for being idealist or something, whatever they think that means. But actually what Lenin is saying is that communism is asking for utopia. It is asking for the impossible, because the impossible is the very thing that is made possible by the moment of rupture. That's what Lenin's saying. And that's exactly what Marx is saying, is what this is saying here. That maybe Marx looks simplified because when the revolution, when the moment of rupture is happening or whatever, or when their revolution seems, afoot, that's when you can make these statements, and they're not non-dialectical, because the whole point of dialectic is that things change. So something that may not seem dialectical at some points later does become dialectical. I think that's exactly what this is saying. I was going to do longer notes. I think that's really all that is to it so far. Okay, the first part I was going to notes on. I don't think I need to notes on it. It's just I've never read Habermas. I don't think you actually need to read Habermas to understand this paper, what it's saying. I think I just extracted what this paper is about. Anyways, this makes it possible Instead, he seeks theoretical certainty for its eternal existence, or in the best case, wishes to civilize it beyond recognition. This makes it possible for him to utilize and refine Parsons' theory of communication media. With the help of the media, power, and money, Habermas presents a sequence of social formations that ironically echoes those of the young Marx. Yet Habermas' theoretical construction excludes not only magical connotations that should give cause for pause, there is also a sequence itself. The immediate unity of the life world and the system in tribal society, the separation of the two forms in the high culture, and finally, the extreme form in which the life world itself appears only as a subsystem among others. The sequence is not without metaphysical references. Habermas presents here in inverted form a specific characteristic of modern society. Although everything can only emerge from the life world and would not be anything without it, the life world is treated as a mere moment of the whole. This treatment reduces the life world to a factor among others. Its constitutive existence seems to disappear. It is, in Adorno's words, merely carried along. Of course, it should not be overlooked that with his differentiation between developmental logic and developmental dynamic, Habermas introduces a completely new approach to the understanding of history. Indeed, his theory seems to render intelligible the transition from tribal societies to class societies with political organization. Here he relies especially on the works of Claus Eder. In any case, it is precisely this transition that Habermas thematizes most strongly. There is hardly any elaboration of the transition from political class societies to modernity. This transition is much more important. It is, in my opinion, no accident that there are only a few comments on this transition. The conception of society that Habermas adopts from sociological discourse theory may be capable of explaining the first transition, above all in combination with his notion of developmental logic, but for the second transition, that to modernity, it fails. His failure is hardly surprising. His fundamental concepts themselves entail the constitutive weakness of his theory, especially and ironically his concept system. Its origin is unthinkable without capitalist society. It is in this society that the concept of system is grounded in real terms. It belongs to capitalism. Faced with the specific dynamic of the gradual process of autonomization of exchange values, with the Moloch-like expansion of the autonomized production, where use value is not just carried out along, but where use value is in fact created in order to preserve itself as autonomized value production. The universalistically defined concept of the system fails. Habermas' universalistic conception of system, in this case economic subsystem, implies a naturalistic concept of production that is ideological in a strict sense. Against this background, the specific character of an autonomized system of value production is unintelligible. It has to be developed through the concept of the dual character of labor. This is the springboard for the critique of political economy that Marx introduced and elaborated, albeit highly insufficiently. However, if labor's constitutive significance for the proper understanding of the dynamic of capital is overlooked, then economics is posed as a theory with the naturalistically given elements. At the end of the third volume of Capital, in the chapter on the Trinitarian formula, Marx summarized with biting irony the structure of argumentation that is today offered as a theory of the production factors. In the Grundrisse, on the other hand, he concentrated above all on the simple circulation as a sphere whose being is in the dialectical presentation of the categories proven to be a pure appearance, in the Hegelian sense. This early construction, that also lies hidden at the foundation of capital, was fully misunderstood by Engels, who popularized it as a simple commodity production. For Marx, the central point of his deciphering of simple circulation is the proof that science can only conceptualize the capitalist economy as a society of exchange, money also a medium, and character and labor exclusively naturalistically. The consequences are considerable in the Grundrisse and really only there. Marx points out that Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, on the basis of which contemporary theory of foreign trade still argued, rests on the appearance of simple circulation. Even the introduction of money as a means of reducing the cost of transactions is based on this appearance of simple circulation. At the same time, and importantly, it lies at the basis of the entire media theory in sociology, and Habermas himself points out that all media are developed in the structural analogy to the medium of money. Alright, now I'm going to try and summarize Habermas' position again, as this essay presents it, it seems accurate since it's kind of even though he obviously disagrees, it is kind of charitable. So Habermas' position is that Marx's critique of bourgeois society can't simply be repeated after the failure of Stalinism and fascism. And so the task is to preserve the rationality within modern bourgeois institutions instead of treating them primarily as alienated social forms like Marx does in his, like he does in when he talks about the bureaucracy in Critique of Philosophy of the Right. And so for Habermas, we should be finding the ideals within the institutions of the bourgeois state that deserve to be preserved in a social society. And so for him, the question is not Marx's critique of forms, but the reconstruction of rationality itself. And so he defines reconstruction as one taking apart a theory and reassembling it in a new form in order to once again achieve the goal that is set for himself. And one of the things that differentiate Habermas from Marx is that he has this tension between labor and interaction. Habermas posits that Marx has made production too central in his theory, and so he was forced to render the concept of production as an absolute. And from Habermas, Habermas separates labor, which he defines as instrumental activity, from communication and action, or normative activity. And he makes this and that makes communicative rationality the foundation for social life. And this is kind of interesting to me because I think, as far as I'm aware, I was talking to someone who's a Deleuze expert. He teaches Deleuze on June 2nd about Deleuze, and this is kind of what he was saying as well, especially what I'm about to read next as part of the summary. So for Habermas, the modern law contains a genuine rational achievement within it, but the content of it serves capitalism, as the content of private law was determined first and foremost by the needs of capitalist economic interaction. So the form of law expresses a higher moral development, but modern law embodies post-conventional structures to consciousness, and therefore do contain universalized principles. But the key feature of this is generality. The modern law should consist of general norms that fundamentally exclude all exceptions and privileges. Habermas sees this not merely as ideology, but as a real achievement of reason, and so modern institutions do contain an emancipatory inheritance within them, which socialism should preserve rather than abolish. And from there, we get to his later developments, because he mentions in the paper Habermas 1, Habermas 2, Habermas' later development. The layer of development is a distinction between the system of money and power in this life world, which is the communicative interaction. That's what that means. If you're confused about it, I was too. That's why I had to look it up. It is used that capitalism colonizes the life world, which again is... Alright, so to explain that, the criticism at the end there is we're saying that Habermas attaches communication and subjectivity from the social norms generated by capital, which is very different from what Marx is doing. Okay, what Marx thinks is that individuality itself is a historically produced phenomena, and the isolated individual is not a natural unit at all, but a social product. Habermas is only partially observing this fact because he's removed it from the critique of political economy itself in his analysis. Habermas is treating money and power as transhistorical mediums that are required by complexity of society, while Marx treats money as a historically specific social form rooted in value production itself. So the crucial starting point here is a conception of the dual power of labor, and without the dual power of labor in the value form, money then becomes this neutral medium, and capital appears as an eternal necessity. And that's why Habermas asks what rational achievements have emerged from modernity and should be preserved, but Marx is asking why human social powers actually even take the form of autonomous institutions like state, the law of money, capital, etc. in the first place. Okay, and that's kind of the major impact. So Habermas is asking what rationality is embedded in bourgeois institutions, but Marx isn't really talking about it at all. He's saying that these institutions themselves are fetishized social relations embedded in society. Okay, Habermas is thinking of emancipation as this as extending communicative rationality over the whole of society. But Marx doesn't see that emancipation that way at all. He sees it as the abolition of social forms that make human power appear independent from human beings in the first place. So, at least how it's written here, Habermas doesn't have an investigation into where bourgeois philosophy really entails believing, or what in fact constitutes the bourgeois subject in the first place. For him, it's all taken as a given, and so he's not capable of producing a revolutionary doctrine, or as Marx would say, a radical doctrine, meaning one that grasps the root of the matter. The next section here is money as medium. In Reconstruction, capitalism was still an explicit topic, the book Reconstruction. There is no longer the case in the theory of communicative action. Habermas focused instead on systems theoretical ideas in the media of money and power. He fails to appreciate that, in doing so, he reproduces the entire world of ideas that is based on the appearance of simple circulation. Let's have a closer look at the two media of money and power. Habermas praises Parson for his brilliant idea of introducing media as mechanisms of integration into his system's theoretical construct. He criticizes Parsons for his overgeneralization of the concept of media. Habermas emphasizes that Parsons' conceptual points of departure for his theory of media can be found in economics, and that for Parsons developed the entire conception of media and structural analogy to the medium of money. Habermas then separates the structural analogy, although only in terms of the media of power, on the basis of his own conception of society as comprising a unity of the life world and systemic unity. Although he accepts this first generalization of power and money as mechanisms of integration is forced, he holds on to it. Thus, money and power do not differ in terms of being able to be measured, circulated, and deposited so greatly that the concept of power as a medium is wholly without value. The section focuses thus on the money medium. Habermas develops the adopted concept of media differently from Parsons. His point of departure is the theory of language, specifically of language as a medium of action coordination. In all systems theoretical concepts, the medium which must be introduced for theory-immanent reasons. In a theory society like Habermas's, however, in which systemic integration is developed out of an action theoretical context, the coordination of the system is conceived as a process that can run much more smoothly than the mastering of a situation with the help of a communicative action. Habermas thus bases his argument not on economics and commodity exchange relations. He does not sketch a theory of exchange, nor does he introduce money in terms of his economically accepted function to decrease transaction costs and so to reduce the complexity of a multiple exchange process. He does not conceive of value in the money form, as Marx does, in terms of the social relations of production, and thus does not develop them from this reproductive structure. Rather, the money medium is conceived abstractly, that is, in terms of what is required to accomplish a substitute for certain linguistic functions. What is meant by media? Becker and Ritzert have characterized this media aspect of Parsons and Habermas' theory with reference to Nietzsche's well-known phrase happy science, gay science from the title of the translation. Completely without reflection, the lacking academic seriousness, this concept was borrowed from a scientific discipline whose polished dogmatism they both mistake for a high level of intellectual maturity. Whereas Parsons repeats completely uncritically neoclassical ideas about the money medium, Habermas adjusts as far as that is possible these ideas to his conception of language as the medium of action coordination. In the life world, communicative action raises the claim of validity in each action simultaneously. These validity tests make it possible to produce a commonly agreed situation definition, and only when agreement has been reached can one action logically follow from another. However, with the introduction of a medium, this aspect of linguistic co-coordination is no longer necessary. This also means that the problem of failed understanding no longer obtains an issue. The entire rationality potential of language, which rests on the requirement of raising validity claims, recedes into the background. Only a few features of language, such as the symbolic embodiment of semantic contents, or the structure of raising and realizing claims, are simulated by media. Habermas relies in his account on Parsons, yet at the same time, his argument moves within an area of economics that today is practiced only by careless economists. Habermas postulates that the medium is so constitutive that it can be measured, sold for various amounts, and saved. It must embody measurable amounts of value that can circulate. These amounts of value, or even masses of value, must be depositable into banks, and finally this medium makes reflexive massing possible as capital. Habermas argues neoclassically, not commodities, but goods are exchanged. It is not buying or selling that takes place, but exchange value equals use. Okay, come on, why? Why do you think this? Come on! No way, does he really think that? That's insane. Disregarding the internal economic critique of the quantifiability of use, he immediately conceives of value as an amount of value which can be circulated, saved, and deposited. Habermas has no idea that he reproduces here the repressed metaphysics of this entire discipline. He does not reflect on which category of value he assumes in each case, but moves uncritically between subjective and objective value categories. Nor does he find problematic concepts like measurable amounts of value or depositable amounts of value. Habermas's neoclassical conceptualization of economics has of course consequences for his theory as a whole. The idea of an economy based on simple circulation repeats in modified form the absolutized individualism of classical economics, whether as methodological individualism or as generalized strategic action, which has no longer anything in common with the ugly class society of capitalism. Habermas's understanding of the systemic integration of action is, in its specific fundamental concepts, harmless. It has no bite. That is again not surprising. I've already emphasized that Habermas seeks to differentiate the evolutionary advantage, this integration level of an economic subsystem that is mediated by money, and its class-specific form of institutionalization. The monetary medium in this theoretically presupposed but unexplained relation of tensions is likewise innocent, as is supposedly Marx's concept of the forces of production in capitalism, which in their material technical structure are also seen to be suitable for the socialist societies. Analogously, in Habermas's theory, his version of the rational society is characterized by the reversal of the colonization of the life world. That is to say, the money medium, like the medium of power, would be forced back into those areas where it occupies its legitimate function as a systems integrated medium, and in now vacated areas, that is where action coordination is inevitably dependent on the linguistic consensus building and on the rationality potential of language. Community action will be re-established. Typically, Habermas does not mention this relations of production. He is concerned only with the way in which his theory of action allows his legal institutionalization of the medium money. Relations of production are considered politically malleable, and finally capitalism is characterized exclusively in terms of its overburdening of the monetary medium. This allows Habermas to retain the evolutionary advantageous integration level, which for him is characteristic of a thoroughly differentiated society. In short, his characterization of capitalism allows him to disregard the drawbacks of a class-specific form of institutionalizationism. Habermas himself admits that he is not much of an economist. He is therefore not in the position to say what is to be understood by the notion of pushing back the overburdened monetary medium. The sole essential feature of his new critical social theory is that money should be driven out of the domain of understanding-oriented action, where, because of its integration mode, it has no business being. For this reason, Habermas talks about the overburdening of the monetary medium. One should not discount the possibility that Habermas has wide-reaching institutional change in mind here, even if the statement to that effect are as elusive as the proverbial needle in the haystack. Personally, I no longer believe that a differentiated economic system can be formed democratically from within in accordance with the simple recipe of worker self-management. The problem seems to be rather one of how capacities for self-organization can be sufficiently developed in autonomous public spheres for the goal-oriented process of will formation, or a use-value-oriented life world to hold the systemic imperative of economic system and state apparatuses in check, and to bring both media-controlled subsystems into dependence on life-world imperatives. I cannot imagine that this would be possible without a gradual abolition of the capitalist labor market, and without a radical democratic implementation of the political parties in their public spheres. The secondary, although in no sense trivial question then arises of how under such altered initial conditions, plans and markets are coordinated with each other, how their relative weights in the interaction of state and economy can shift. This would be difficult for me to anticipate, even if I had better knowledge of economics. That's from Habermas. With the gradual abolition of the capitalist labor market, and this is simply another formulation for the abolition of the private ownership of the means of production, capitalism would be robbed of the conditions of its existence. And it may still be possible to develop a classless society in which the life world, in the form of radical democratic republic, would achieve ever greater significance at the expense of the increasingly marginalized systemic integration. The precondition for such a development is, of course, the mature citizen who, schooled in this ongoing discourse, is able to both articulate his interest in the public sphere and engage in the corresponding democratic legitimation process with a thoroughly rationalized legal process. Democratically constituted opinion and will formation depends on the supply of information, informal public opinion, that ideally develop in structures of an unsubverted political public sphere. The informal public sphere must, for its part, enjoy the support of societal basis, in which equal rights of citizenship have become socially effective. Only on a basis that has emerged from the confines of class and thrown off the millennial-old shackles of social stratification and exploitation can the potential of an unleashed culture from pluralism fully develop. In sum, Habermas's concept system is essentially a loose category within his theory. He conceives of the system as something that is always to be pushed back out of the life world, but it can never be abolished. Were that to happen, as he says, the evolutionary advantageous integration level would likewise disappear. His basic conceptualization, such as the concept of money as medium, takes this into account. The political notion of a gradual decolonization of the life world is based on the idea that the media are neutral. This implies a concept of society whose central category is that of intersubjectivity. The older critical theory, in contrast, puts the concept of social objectivity at the center of its understanding of society. Conceptualization of social law depends, of course, on an understanding of social objectivity. When Habermas takes notes of a capitalist crisis, he has to limit himself to empirical observations. His basic concepts fail to supply theoretical explanations. The harmlessness of this concept of medium is constitutive for his theory, which in contrast to Marx's concept of capital, no longer allows the development of an objective concept of exploitation. This harmlessness also relegates the foundation of political demands to the area of the just distribution of wealth. The relations of production remain taboo. Alright, so yeah, this is getting pretty good. So he's saying that Habermas ends up treating historically specific social forms as if they can be explained from communication and discourse alone, when in fact these, discourses and communications that we're talking about are literally products of capitalism. And therefore, as these are byproducts of capitalism, they confront individuals as objective structures alienated from them. Okay, and he doesn't really address this phenomena. He's more or less just posit that it might not exist, okay? So, for example, just an example that they give in here, okay, money isn't what money is as Marx conceives of it. Instead, for Habermas, it's a substitute for language, which is kind of absurd. Like, you don't trade words with each other, okay? And by doing so, he's repeating an exact criticism that Marx gave of economists of his time. If you read the Goudries, that's exactly what he's saying he's doing. A similar thing can apply to his view of law. He treats the legal form as an already existing form, which then, in his words, I'm mincing my words. He then discovers the rationality that is hidden within this form, apparently. And at no point does Habermas ever realize that human beings are who creates these social forms, and that they confront human beings as objective realities that are alien to them. And he can't really explain this because his entire framework begins with communicative actors and not social relations. The problem we're dealing with here is structurally identical to that of the genesis of the value form itself. Economists falsely derive money from exchange efficiency, while Habermas falsely derives laws from discourse, as in physically speaking to other people. By this, not discourse in some grander metaphorical way, and never even ask why people are speaking the way that they do in the first place. This is kind of similar to what the Deleuzians kind of argue, because it's like he thinks there's an inbuilt motor of speech that inherently gives it value in itself, like they do with desire. They think it's valuable in itself, and it's a 1 to 0 mechanism. Legal theory. This section returns to Habermas' central category, the legal form. He develops this category along the same theoretical lines and with the same analytical tools as his conceptualization of the medium money. This allows him to shape his central category in a much more precise way than in his earlier works. In addition, and importantly, his theory is designed to safeguard the existence of the legal system. He provides, in fact, theoretical guarantees against threats to its existence. Indeed, for him, the possibility of an autonomous legal system is an exciting prospect. Okay, that just seems like fascism, dude. That just seems like fascism with extra steps. He wasn't a Hitler youth. That was a terrible word swap. Actually, maybe it was a better word swap. Never mind. No wonder then, always hope is focused on this. The discursive reason that he sees incorporated in positive law implies for him a potential for rationalizing, which in a certain sense propels the modern state of law beyond itself. In contrast to Adorno Horkheimer's dialectic of enlightenment, Habermas's dialectic of rationalization points to a brighter future. Amazing, because the law's modes of validity entail the rationally motivated recognition of normative claims of validity, there exists the possibility that rational arguments can explode the legal form in which they have hitherto taken place. Habermas has attempted to demonstrate this paradigmatically in his study of civil disobedience, and later he transferred this notion of the legal system to the legal system as a whole. As Habermas puts it, a legal system does not acquire autonomy on its own. It is autonomized only to the extent that the legal procedures institutionalized for legislation and the administration of justice guarantee impartial judgment and provides the channels through which practical reason gains entrance into law and politics. There can be no autonomous law without the realization of democracy. It is easily misled here by the societally unphilosophical terminology. What he proposes is in fact a most ambitious program. In places, even the Hegelian critique of philosophy of understanding shimmers through, as for instance, where he postulates a necessary internal connection between human rights and popular sovereignty, or when he claims that there is an interconnection between democracy and the state of law. As long as philosophy argues from within the constraints of philosophy of consciousness, so runs Habermas's criticism. It has not only to pose human rights and popular sovereignty as two opposing rights, but also to render absolute one or the other. Yet Habermas argues these two rights are internally related, they belong together. What needs to be done then is to go beyond their respective limitations that are internal to each. In order to explicate in a stringently conceptual manner the rational unity of human rights and popular sovereignty. Hence the critique of Kant and Rousseau. Habermas claims that such stringent conceptualization is possible on the basis of a newly acquired linguistic theory and the theory of universal pragmatism. He thus claims to be able to ground in a discursive manner the simultaneous origin of both rights. In other words, Habermas claims that his theory allows him to craft in precise terms the unity between human rights and popular sovereignty, a task in which all theoreticians before him failed! Exclamation mark! Legal theory is the goal and culmination of Habermas's theory of rationality. He claims to show a rational discursive action is already deeply ingrained in social institutions, rendering possible the emergence of a rational discursive reality. Habermas regards his legal theoretical constructions as a solution to the basic deficiency of Marxism and critical theory. According to Habermas, both these theories have not been able to decipher the moral categories built into bourgeois legal institutions. Both thus fail to appreciate and imagine alternative political practices, or in other words, Marx and critical theory are reproached for summoning a concept of reason that points towards a world beyond capitalism. Habermas seeks a better world within the established order, hence his critique of Marx and critical theory. These theories are reproached for employing a concept of reason that is without normative foundations. For Habermas, the normative foundation of the existing legal order supplies the basis for the future. Let us look again at Habermas's Sternberger theses. Here, the thematization of the legal form is central, in contrast to the Marxist project, according to which this form would have to be developed from its base. Habermas starts out from the already existing forms and attempts to decipher the reason embodied in them. He interprets the content of these forms, in accord with Marxism, as fully functional for capitalism's systematic development. In terms of the forms itself, he differentiates four characteristics: positivity, formality, legality, and especially generality. These can likewise be characterized as functional for the systemic rationality of capitalism, but because their form, they could just as easily be functionalized for different purposes, namely, the gradual decolonization of the life world from the overburdened monetary medium. His Between Facts and Norms suggests that Habermas charges that in modernity, traditional ethics no longer obtains in a unitary form. Instead, it is divided into modern morality and formal law. Of course, there exists a functional relationship between them. However, since they have been divided, each requires a new foundation. This is what Habermas seeks to do. Since the inherited notions of natural law have been dismantled long ago, discourse theory is the only path still available. In our context, only the foundational structure of law is of interest. We have already noted that the starting position of theory of communicative action is the systemic integration has to be anchored in the life world. The same holds for this conception of success-oriented strategic action. Habermas presumes, along with Durkheim, Weber, and Parsons, that the stabilization of the economic subsystem cannot succeed exclusively on the basis of success-oriented action. Where this possible, an exclusively instrumental order would arise. Such an order would be very unstable, and attempts at stabilizing it would have to rely on norms. The purpose of Habermas's legal theory is to determine the nature of these norms. Habermas emphasizes that the historical point of departure for the modern development of law is to be found in private law, which is the core of modern law. The discourse theoretical reconstruction of the rationality of law and the deciphering of reason embodied in law must therefore begin with subjective rights. Quote, I understand this interpretation as a logical genesis of rights, which one can reconstruct in a gradual fashion. One begins by applying the discourse principle to the general rights of the liberties, a right constitutive for the legal forms as such, and ends by legally institutionalizing the conditions for a discursive exercise of political autonomy. By means of this political autonomy, the private autonomy that at first abstractly posited can retroactively assume an elaborated legal shape. These lines sum up, once again, the entire claim of Habermas's project to supply, really for the first time, a theoretical consistent connection between popular sovereignty and human rights. Let us take a closer look at this notion of legal form. In the Sternberger thesis, Habermas cannot hesitate to see private law as part of modern law, and modern law is characterized as an embodiment of post-conventional consciousness. In Between Facts and Norms, however, he is considerably more cautious. Here it remains unclear whether private law represents the legal form, or whether it merely sets up the legal form. This ambiguity is in no way a result of definitional laxness. Rather, it is symptomatic of legal theory's systematic point of departure. Klaus Günther, a jurisprudent colleague of Habermas, and to whom he owes as much as he mentions in the foreword to Between Facts and Norms, so much institution that he must almost hesitate to relieve him of responsibility for my mistake, has stressed the dyad of compulsory authority and private autonomy as the most striking feature of the legal form. These characteristics are, as Gunther expressively points out, quote, historically given. They describe nothing but the fact that regulation of social interaction has legal form. If any society wants to regulate its social interaction in such a way that it forcibly ensures that its citizens adhere to legitimate norms without in doing so injuring its moral intuitions, and without excluding rational and motivability altogether, then it must serve this legal form with its stated characteristics. This is the point where, in my opinion, the critique must begin. The legal form that these characteristics is assumed to be historically given, now everything depends essentially on 1. How this legal form is developed theoretically in the specific duality, and 2. How this connection between legal form and the principle of discourse can be conceptualized. Habermas has demonstrated that there exists a necessary interconnection, i.e., the principle of discourse is not externally applied to the legal form. Only when this can be shown can Habermas claim to decipher the post-conventional form of consciousness embodied in the institutions of law be maintained. With regard to 1, as mentioned earlier, Habermas connects this duality of life world and system in an action-theoretical manner, and he conceives of system as a specific form of integration. This must be stabilized through specific norms, that is, it must be anchored in the life world. It is worth noting that Habermas in no way develops the historically given legal forms from a specifically social starting point. Rather, he constructs it from the premise of his basic action theoretical concepts. He is looking for particular norms that must satisfy 2 criteria. According to the above analysis, the type of norms required would have author's emphasis to bring about the willingness to comply simultaneously by means of de facto constraint and legitimate validity. None of this kind would have to appear with an authority that once again equips validity with the force of the factual. Only this time under the condition of polarization already existing between action oriented to success and that oriented to reach understanding, which has to say under the conditions of perceived incompatibility of facticity and validity. As we have already assumed, the meta-social guarantees of the sacred have broken down, and these guarantees are what made the ambivalent bonding force of archaic institutions possible, thereby allowing an amalgam of validity and facticity in the validity dimension itself. The solution to this puzzle is found in the system of rights that leads to the individual liberties, the coercive force of law. We can then also see, from a historical perspective, that the core of modern law consists of private rights that mark out the legitimate scope of individual liberties and are thus tailored to the strategic pursuit of private interest. As could already be surmised from these formulations, Habermas's procedure is analogous to his contradiction of the monetary medium, which, as we've seen, is developed entirely from the perspective of the linguistic coordination of understanding-oriented action. In his construction of the medium money, Habermas postulates that the standardized action situation allows the neglect of specific linguistic acts. This postulate is carried over to his conception of the legal form. This form is deduced from entirely theoretical construct and is understood as a unity of autonomy, freedom, and legal constraint. On this one hand, rules must present de facto restrictions that alter the relevant information in such a way that the strategic actor feels compelled to adapt her behavior in the objectively desired manner. On the other hand, they must at the same time develop a socially integrated force by imposing obligations on the addressee, which, according to my assumptions, is possible only on the basis of intersubjectively recognizing normative validity claims. At times, Habermas appears to agree with the Marxist determination of the legal form as a unity of autonomy, freedom, and legal constraint. Nevertheless, what needs to be asked here is whether Habermas, even when he appears to share Marxist insights, projects his action theoretical premise onto a historically given legal form, and that he does so merely in order to pull them out again, like the proverbial rabbit out of the hat, in order to construct them rationally. The title of Gunther's defense poses this in a nutshell: a discourse theory of law, or liberal natural law and discourse theory's clothing. Oh, that's a banger. Let us now look at our second point, the connection between the legal form and the principles of discourse. The question is this: is it possible to decipher the legal form insofar as the validity mode of rational legitimacy is concerned as a specific form in which the same compelling unity of meaning, validity, claim, and discourse can be established? Just as Habermas postulates these as necessary components of coordination in communicative action. Since every valid norm is supposed to embody rationality, it must at the very least have passed through the filter of rational discourse. Just as all substantiated knowledge comes into being through the questioning of implicitly raised validity claims. Characteristic in this context is a circular argument in which Gunther gets caught when he presents the rational elements of the legal form as necessary components of this same form. In Gunther's sketch of Habermas's position, the acting subjects are both the addressee and the author of the law. They constitute the law to which they simultaneously subject themselves out of respect for this law. At the same time, however, Gunther, like Habermas, maintains that the acting subjects will contingently encounter the historically given legal form. How is that conceivable? Gunther breaks the matter down in the following way: because the legal form cannot be derived in a discourse theoretical manner. There is no normative necessity of any kind for subjects capable of speech and action to unite a community under the law. Rather, the decision to make use of the historically given legal form in order legitimately to regulate social relations with the help of positive law is entirely contingent. In good Kantian fashion, these actors are subjugated as empirical subjects to the world of causality and are thereafter unfree, coerced into using the historically given legal form. As intelligible subjects in the rational reconstruction, however, they can make their own decisions. Of course, this decision is contingent only from the perspective of discourse theory. It is indisputable that this decision is conditioned historically and socially by complex, improbable premises. The discourse theoretician of legal form appears to have to seek refuge in fictitious formula. He asks us to suppose a fictitious society of free people in order to predicate the existence of the legal form, rendering it theoretically justified. At the same time, this legal form is assumed to be a historically given, but when a society decides to unite as a community under the law, then it must accept these characteristics out of the legal form. Among the most prominent of these is a private autonomy, the other side of legal constraint. These characteristics are historically given. This society that decides contingently is in the counterfactual premises of communicative action, the legal theoretical concretization of the fiction of an ideally expanded assembly hall. According to this postulate of discourse theory, this historically given legal form, since it contains the specific characteristics of guaranteed liberty and legal constraint, i.e. an embodiment of rationality, must already be produced a product of discourse. Gunther concedes this too. Quote, "It is self-evident that the citizen, insofar as they mutually acknowledge each other as addresses of the law, are also, in a function, since already authors, just as the citizens of Hobbes' state of nature, or consignation of devils, are in a certain sense the authors of their mutually granted right of liberty. For this reason, even the theoretician who connects the discourse principle with legal form can observe, so to speak, from the outside, that the citizens who have not chosen to regulate their coexistence with the help of legitimate law must also implicitly grant each other the role of author of those laws, as the bearer of which they mutually recognize themselves. Nevertheless, without a discourse principle, it would not even be possible to recognize even from the outside, not to mention from the perspective of the citizens themselves, that the bearers of the law also must be their authors. As empirical subjects, however, they are only functional authors, such as they are not aware that they are makers of legitimate law in the Habermas sense. It is for the discourse theoretician to explain this to them. But is the legitimacy of law not supposed to be tied to the discourse which they themselves carry out? This then is the basis on which the entire legal system is to be reconstructed. As we have already emphasized in the discussion of the Sternberger theses, Habermas' reconstruction of the rational content of modern law and his deciphering of the post-conventional forms of consciousness in modern law can only be convincing if he can demonstrate a direct connection between discursive rationality and the form of the norms themselves. For this reason, the issue of the generality of the legal norms stands at the center of Habermas' quest for rationality. And this because the generality of the norm is connected immediately with the legitimacy of bourgeois law. Does this, however, hold true for private law, which is the core of modern law, and is characterized by the generality of norms? In my view, it does not. Of course, others have noticed this weakness as well, and Gunther, in his exegesis of Habermas' legal theory, has had to defend himself against the contention that discourse theory had only been applied externally, from the outside, to modern law. These characteristics of the legal form may not be reified and restrictively laid down at the normative substratum of citizens' democratic self-determination process. Rather, this legal form and its characteristics now enter into linkage with the discourse principle, and it is this which produces the system of law, not legal form. At first from the perspective of the theoretician, then with the establishment of the rights of political participation and of a democratic process of the formation of public opinion based on the recommendations and decisions of politically autonomous citizens. That the problem we are dealing with here is structurally identical to that of the genesis of the value form. When Marx announced that he was developing his critique as science in the German sense, he was referring to the genetic development of the money form and the other categories of political economy. That was modeled on Hegel's logic, so his critique was twofold. On the one hand, the genetic representation of real value forms, that is to say, of money, capital, etc., in the reality of capitalism, and on the other hand, the critique of economic theory, whose specific characteristic, and those of current economic theory too, is its disregard for the genesis of its form, and in part its complete lack of awareness of the problem as such. As Marx puts it, political economy now has analyzed, albeit incompletely, value and value amount, and discovered the hidden content in these forms, but not once did it raise the question as to why this content took that form. Marx also described these forms as objective forms of thought, subject-objective categories, forms of unity that result naturally from relations between human beings, but that cannot be traced back to conscious, intentional action. Rather, they're constituted in and through human action. At the same time, from the perspective of the acting individual, they appear as something given. The core problem of Marx's critique is this: How is it possible to understand the circumstances that human action is constitutive action at the same time as human beings appear to be ruled by already established existing abstractions? In his logic, Hegel had already anticipated this problem in terms of the unity of positing reflection and external reflection. In academic economic theory, regardless of whether value theory it favors or whether, in neo-Ricardian fashion, it renounces theory altogether, money is derived as a reduction of transaction cost. From Marx's perspective, however, derivations such as these are only fictional derivations. They represent the historically given money form as the result of the intentional action of participants. Such quote-unquote theory misses its target. The element of universality and unity that the money form represents cannot be traced back to the intentional or rational behavior. Economics is not technology. The same assessment holds for the legal form. It is constituted by individuals who at the same time encounter it as something already given. Gunther expressed this view quite clearly. Without, however, being aware of it, people must make use of the historically given legal form at the same time as they are its functional authors, since the people have also to be the creators of this form. Legal form is in itself, as Hegel would say, a form of unity, and in my opinion, as Habermas seeks to grasp the conception of the unity and universality of the form itself when he postulates an internal relationship between validity and discourse. Discourse ought to constitute this moment of universality and unity, but can this be, since legal form already shows this constitution prior to all discourse? It is this movement of the unity and universality of legal form, and indeed of subjective private law, that Hegel links with the concept of general will, and which Kant defines as the moral moment of law as the universal law of freedom. But even Kant and Hegel begin with the already constituted form as a fact of reason. Hegel's genetic developments in philosophy of law are therefore only fictional derivations. But how might the genesis of this form be conceived? There are hints in Marx's early work, above all in the German ideology. The starting point for Marx's argument is the perception of a particular formed situation in bourgeois society, whose treatment is comparable to that of the money form in his critique of political economy. At times, he presents his treatment in rather drastic formulations. The attitude of the bourgeois to the institutions of his regime is like that of the Jew to the law, and he evades them whenever it is possible to do so in each individual case, but he wants everyone else to observe them. If the entire bourgeoisie in mass and all at once were to evade bourgeois institutions, it would cease to be bourgeois. A conduct which of course never occurs to the bourgeois and by no means depends on their willing or cunning. The dissolute bourgeois evades marriage and secretly commits adultery. The merchant evades the institution of property by depriving others of property by speculation, bankruptcy, etc. The young bourgeois makes himself independent of his own family, if he can, by in fact abolishing the family as far as he is concerned. But marriage, property, the family remain untouched in theory because they are a practical basis on which the bourgeoisie has erected its domination, and because in their bourgeois form, they are the conditions which make bourgeois a bourgeois. Just as the constantly evaded law makes the religious Jew a religious Jew. This attitude of the bourgeois is the condition of his existence, acquires one of the universal forms in bourgeois morality. What Marx sketches here is a structural peculiarity of the bourgeois relations of reproduction based on the division of labor. A structure in which everyone is dependent on everyone else, and each person can only reproduce himself inasmuch as all others become means for him. On the basis of this initial situation, each person is endowed with two contradictory interests. Each individual can only pursue and realize her own particular interest when her conditions of reproduction, which are identical to those of everyone else, are accepted, respected, and recognized by everyone else. But each individual is like all others, so that from the start everyone has two hearts beating in her breast. She has a particular will, at the same time, shares with all others a will in which they are all united, which is common to all, such as is universal. This will common to all refers to the preservation of life conditions that are common to all, and that are conditioned through which particular interests are realized. Quote, the individuals who rule in these conditions, leaving aside the fact that their power must assume the form of the state, have to endow their will, which is determined by these definite conditions, with a universal expression as the will of the state, as law, an expression whose content is always determined by the relations of this class, as the civil and criminal law demonstrates in the clearest possible way. Just as the weight of their bodies does not depend on their idealistic will or on their own arbitrary decisions, so also the fact that they enforce their own will in the form of law, and at the same time make it independent of the personal arbitrariness of each individual among them, does not depend on their idealistic will. Their personal rule must at the same time assume the form of average rule. Their personal power is based on living conditions which in their development are shared by many individuals, and the continuation of which they, as ruling individuals, must preserve in opposition to others, while at the same time maintain that they should hold that they hold these conditions to be for the good of all. The expression of this will, which is determined by their common interest, is the law. It is precisely because individuals who are independent of one another assert themselves in their own will, and because of this basis their attitude to one another is bound to be egotistical, that self-denial is made necessary in the law and right. This is not, of course, a satisfying theoretical development of the legal form, but Marx does not show the way forward. Two aspects are essential. One is the historically produced egoistic mode of action, which can only be realized when each individual respects and recognizes the conditions for reproduction that are common to all. Thus, everyone is simultaneously both a particular and a universal. As a universal, she is the abstract proprietor, and in this definition, she is identical to, undifferentiated from, all others. And this universality and unity of people is posited for itself and maintained by the threat of coercion as a universal will existing for itself, as the law that guarantees private autonomy and that is equipped with the power of legal constraint. The individual then of course can also act out of respect for the law, because it is in the law that her universal will, which is identical with that of all others, is incorporated without her having as author in a discourse given her consent. She is, as Gunther declares, a functional author, and can then, of course, act strategically, as well as act like religious Jew in the above-cited passage of Marx. At the same time, and this is the second aspect, Marx emphasizes that the reality of this egoistical action is founded on the existence of class. The reality of bourgeois society is not that of the simple exchange of goods, but the appropriation and a surplus production in the form of values and the maintenance and the expansion of these values. So when the discussion turns to the amounts of value that are circulated, stored, and even expanded, then Marx is not always focused on the abstract objective value, and not on the contemplated value, as Marx puts it in the Bourgeoisie, but rather on the enduring total value, which in its existence is preserved by the permanent extraction of surplus labor from the working class. The reality of egoistic action, its form and content, cannot be divorced from the relations of production. Were one to do that, one would have either to declare it absolute in an anthropological naturalistic manner, or espouse it as a success-oriented strategic action, elevating egoistic action to an ahistorical theoretical construct. In both cases, the notion's relations of production would be negated and therewith dismissed in an a priori manner as the proper foundation for the understanding of egoistic action. It is questionable whether Habermas's basic conceptualization, the categorical distinction between understanding-oriented action and strategic action, is able to recognize the circumstances that the communal conditions of reproduction represent the conditions of the possibility of strategic action. Concerning strategic action, there is no doubt that we find in the act of exchange a silent symmetrical recognition of liberty and equality. There is, in other words, a reciprocal, as yet abstract and unintended position of the participants as private owners of property. This insight would of course be entirely comparable to the Habermasian construction of the symmetrical premise of communication in the ideal speech situation. Yet for Habermas, the ideal speech situation takes place only in understanding-oriented action. The fact, however, that the reciprocal relation of recognition can be expressed as legal form in private law and acquire a de facto validity is founded on the existence of a laboring commodity. The working class, characteristically in defining the norm of autonomy and legal constraint, Habermas does not even begin to consider the really existing antagonism of interest. Instead, he focuses on their institutionalized form. According to Habermas, it is only within the confines of a developed legal form that one can act strategically. Where, for the discourse theoreticians, do equal individual rights originate? The actors, according to Habermas and Günther, find legitimate law as given in the legal form. They do not contribute to its creation as conscious beings, but merely as functional authors. These authors create equal subjective law, and they do that automatically and without any prior consideration about the meaning and substance of this equality. Does the legal form entail equal subjective rights, or have the discourse theoreticians projected these into the legal form? The principle of, quote, the principle of discourse, moreover, also brings to light yet another implication of the decision to regulate coexistence according to legal form. There must be equal rights to individual liberty. Only then, when a reciprocal change of perspective is possible for them, can those who correspondingly should restrict their individual liberty come to see that coexistence in individual liberty is possible only in the form of an equal right to liberty, with equal rights to realize that liberty. These conditions, and with them the insight into the necessity of an equal distribution of the right to subjective freedom, are first made explicit through the principle of discourse, from Günther. It is the principle of discourse, and not the relationship between the owners of private property, which it seems have to be deciphered as the in itself of equal subjective rights. For Habermas, the principle of discourse, anchored as it is in universal communicative premises, allows us to understand why equal rights entail subjective freedom. For Habermas, this is the way it has to be. The central bourgeois principles of liberty, equality, and justice are not allowed to result from the relations of production or exchange. Rather, Habermas has to look for their origin in the universal premises of communication. On this basis, he is able to argue that democracy has proven itself to be the realization of universal reason. Given this theoretical framework, Habermas is not able to ask whether an a priori character of the idea of freedom, equality, and justice might possibly be connected with the bourgeois relations of property. I have already shown the circularity of thought in this theoretical starting position regarding the rational reconstruction of law. This is neither surprising nor coincidental. The entire line of political philosophy, from Hobbes through Rousseau and Kant to Hegel, approaches legal form in the same way as economics assumes the money medium in other categories. That is, the legal form is approached as if it were merely an existing form, and for this reason the approach has always to presuppose human beings as legal subjects. This presupposition of the human being as an a priori legal subject can take different forms. A person in the state of nature may be endowed with so-called natural rights. Whether the characteristics of legal form are given as the natural rights of pre-social individuals, or with Kant, the law may be defined as the totality of conditions in which the arbitrariness of each individual, according to universal laws of freedom, is in harmony with the arbitrariness of all others. In this way, the individual finds the universal law of freedom itself given as a fact of reason. It is amazing that Habermas, not even in his theory of law, does not engage in any meaningful way with Hegel. Even more amazing is that he does not deal anywhere in the expressive and precise terms with the notion abstract law itself. He employs this notion— I just killed a mosquito, like, not even looking. That's crazy. Anyways, he employs this notion in the Sternberger thesis, but it does not reappear in his later work on legal theory. Yet he proposes that practical reason, that is, post-conventional structures of consciousness, are embodied in law. The postulated generality of the legal norms is understood in an essential characteristic of the rationality of norms. This rationality, according to Habermas, is closely connected with the legitimacy of modern law. This raises the question how the relationship between the generality of norms and the forms of abstract law is to be understood. It is obvious that Habermas' central thesis, that ideas are embodied in norms, is drawn from Hegel, so it is even more remarkable that he never even sketches how this concept of embodiment differs from Hegel's notion of objectification. The lack of a conceptualization of abstract law is very curious indeed. Let us take a quick look at Hegel's philosophy of right. In the addendum to paragraph 71, when he thematizes the transition from property to contract, Hegel adds, "In a contract I hold property on the strength of a common will." That is to say, in the interest of reason. that the subjective will should become universal and raise itself to this degree of actualization. Thus, in contract to my will still has the character of this will, thought has it in the community with another will. The universal will, however, still appears here only in the form and guise of community. Like Habermas, Hegel ties reason to legal form, so the general will can represent itself as general will. The subjective will should be universal will, but it initially becomes so only as common will. And at the same time, however, it already is, in this form of commonality, a general will, if at first only in itself. The above leads to the understanding that even common will in a contract is not adequate to the notion of the universal will. In his handwritten remarks to paragraph 81 in an addendum, Hegel speaks therefore in the communal will as an arbitrary universality. Why? The pausing of an indidentical will in a contract means that the two contracting parties are indistinguishable. The contract demonstrates an immanent universality precisely as the indistinguishability of two wills, which Hegel there referred to in a handwritten addendum, paragraph 79, that the will that with another is posited as one. The contract is the unity of different wills, and thus a unity in which both parties surrender their differences instead of their special characters. There arises then a new form of unity. This form is brought about exclusively by communal positing and receives its validation beyond the immediacy of the communal positing. As long as the contract exists in immediately communal terms, however, this specific quality of immanent generality remains tied with the specific content of the contract. The universal aspect of the contract emerges as such only gradually. It becomes conscious through its negation. The specifically legal character then constitutes itself unconsciously. In his handwritten addendum to paragraph 81, Hegel argued what is bound and what is binding in will of both is that in it there is a being in itself and the law in itself, i.e. the existence of the will as such. In the contract, both have alienated not only their particular wills, but also presupposed that what is valid, the existence of the will in general, what is the law in this situation, this is the inner essential condition, breaking the contract, the failure to perform, is entirely against the law. This will is lawful because it ought to be valid, and the validity means that it is binding. This is one of the conditions that are involved in communal positing without the participant being entirely and immediately conscious of that fact. It enters into the consciousness of the actors as injustice. Now the character of generality, that is the generality of law, comes to consciousness in the contract. The principality of law in itself is present as something posited, and its inner universality is there as a commonality of arbitrariness and that of the particular will. This appearance of the law, in which it, in its essential existence, the particular will, correspond immediately and fortuitously, is next transformed into an opposition between the law in itself and the particular will. What we find here in that arbitrariness is subsumed into the universal will. There arises then a new problematic, insofar as the particular wills are subsumed, or with Habermas embodied in this single will. Their various contents that are presented in this form obtain now only as particular contents of contract. The substitution of this form, a form of unity, entails an inversion. The particular content appears now only as an example and presents itself as a particular application of the contract. The unity of the form presents generality, which includes all particularities. The validity claim law ought to be valid is internally connected with the abstract form of law, its generality and universality. This form then appears itself as something universal and unconditional, what is ought to be valid. Let us leave behind Hegel's speculative representation of law-legal development and focus instead on the extractable individual motives. What is worth noting, though, is that there are remarkable parallels to Habermas's method of rational reconstruction. For example, the validity claims raised in every speech act entails universality, and this cannot be otherwise since it is the basis of all discourse theory. Yet, when the validity claim is raised, the possibility exists that universality becomes a conscious issue, and the same holds for the claim of intersubjective validity. This then is the beginning of discourse. The identical structure in Hegelian and Habermasian argumentation is underscored by Hegel's remark in the addendum to paragraph 86. Just as in the case of unintentional injustice, universal rightness is respected and willed by both, and the wrong consists merely in person holding what he wants for what is right. Just as the principle of rightness comes to consciousness as something universal, so in the judgment a rose is not red, it is recognized that it has a color, hence I do not deny the genius, all that I negate is the particular color red. The validity claim is accepted as such. Both participants in the discourse agree that the truth ought to be found, only the individual statement is called into question. This situation is different for Hegel in terms of his concept of fraud, and for Habermas in terms of strategic action. With fraud, the law itself is negated, but simultaneously still maintained as appearance. The principle of rightness is characterized as something demanded as the essential thing, yet in this situation, it is still only something demanded, thus the universal is set aside by the particular will and reduced to something only showing. The actor acts strategically when he treats the validity claim as mere appearance. That is, when he presumes validity claims in communicative action, objectifies this premise, and at the same time maintains it only for the sake of appearance. Habermas does not see these parallels, or at least he does not bother to mention them, for were he to do so, he would have to rethink his entire theory. The form of contract law and the proceeding from it, the construction of property in private law, which Hegel conceives of as a general will, results from the arbitrary behavior of the participants. Yet, the specific form of the positing of both unity and universality constitutes the objectivity of a form that contains an unconditional demand for validity, and that is recognition. The form of law can thus not be interpreted as the result of the subjective intentions of the multitude, rather the law has to be recognized, that is, obeyed. Habermas's point of departure is strategic action, that is, the arbitrary behavior of the participating actors. His argument implies the formal law can come into being only on the basis of universalizable interest. These can be discerned and made precise in discourse regardless of whether they're already legally organized. For Habermas, there can be no such thing as an interest that is predetermined as universal. This is in contradistinction to Marx. For him, the bourgeois relations of production entail that totality in which the human individual moves and acts is determined action, and this determined action takes place inevitably in exchange, where all actors are connected with each other through mutual respect and perception. In short, the conditions of social reproduction are common to all. The positing of the form of contract is the core of modern law. The further development of this form of contract in its elaboration in the law of property and inheritance posits conditions of exchange that are implicitly recognized in any exchange as the expression of the universal will, which at the same time is equipped with the power to sanction. The claim that the law ought to be valid unconditionally is reinforced by the state's power to sanction, but this does not take place in the legally organized discourse. It is rather the work of jurists and state authorities. For Habermas, the form of law is conceived as something that is not only universally applicable, but also in the universal interest of everyone. Really? Everyone? Of course not everyone. Equipped with the category of strategic action and money as medium, Habermas's innocuous action theoretical conceptualization works within the parameters of economic thought, where money is attempted to be derived as a reduction of transaction cost. If one would still wish to consider this sort of thing a theory, then Marx's critique in the Grundrisse of the appearance of circulation might be a good guide for understanding the theoretical appeal of such wonders. In the reality of bourgeois society, however, we have to deal with the commodity capital, industrial capital, and money capital, contracts that are concluded among property owners who have as their primary goal the realization of a profit margin. Hardly a pleasant matter, and these infinitely many contracts between the owners of the means of production are made possible by the infinitely many contracts with those who are free to sell their labor power, the workers who produce surplus value, but on the surface of society, as Marx calls it, all appearance as contracting parties, as persons, as exchange participants, and not in their character mask as members of their respective classes. The contents of contract, however, are conditioned by the existence of classes. In reality of bourgeois society, we will always have to deal with the actual contract, in which for reasons even arbitrariness and general will in Hegel's world coincidentally concur. In his concept of general will, Hegel not only translated Rousseau's Volonté Generale into German, but also sought to grasp the moment of the supernatural this, that is, the moment of unity and universality that cannot be traced back to the intentionality of all. That would be the Volonté de tous. Just as each specific commodity contains use values and exchange values, both unity and multiplicity, so to the agents in the act of exchange as owners of value, they are indistinguishable and posited as equals. A unity as the possessors of concrete things. They comprise a multiplicity. Modern theories of lateral law, as well as those of sovereignty, wallow around in categorical unconsciousness within this pre-given constellation. They posit in advance people as always already equal and free legal subjects, and as contracting parties, but can only conceive of political forms as something that is the result of intentional action. Habermas's espousal of what he calls the self-understanding of modern legal theory conceives of sovereignty and human rights through the lenses of a deliberate radical democracy. Habermas tells us more than he's conscious of. The self-proclaimed heir to critical theory practices exactly that for which critical theory reproached traditional theory. Habermas shares with traditional theory the inability to thematize and to develop genetically the actual forms of bourgeois society. Insofar as Habermas is a critical theoretician, he does not connect his theory to reality. Insofar as he connects it to reality, his theory is not critical, a twice half-baked theory. Alright, this last section here is basically the real core argument of the whole essay summarized. So, in conclusion, legal forms are not consciously designed products of human discourse, but objective social forms which arise behind the backs of individuals. How is it possible to understand the circumstances that human action is constitutive action at the same time as human beings appear to be ruled by already existing abstractions? In his logic, Hegel had already anticipated this problem in terms of the unity of positing reflection and external reflection. All are human products, yet they appear independent of human will, as money, law, capital, estate, etc. all confront them as already existing powers. Marx describes these forms as objective forms of thought, subjective objective categories, forms of unity that result naturally from relations between human beings, but cannot be traced back to conscious intentional action. Rather, they are constituted in and through human action. At the same time, from the perspective of the acting individual, they appear as something given. The legal form cannot be explained by asking why rational individuals choose such a legal system, but explaining how relations generate a legal form that appears independent of those who participate in it, the social contract. Habermas explains laws from actors, which represents the historically given money form as the result of the intentional action of participants. Each individual can pursue and realize her own particular interest when her conditions of reproduction, which are identical to those of everyone else, are accepted, respected, and recognized. In other words, everyone has two hearts beating in her breast. She has a particular will, and at the same time, shares with all others a will in which they are all united, meaning individuals pursue private interests, yet their private interests require universal social conditions. Therefore, a universal will emerges not because people, vote for it or decide it, but because they deliberate, but because their reproduction depends upon it. The legal form is the necessary universal form through which competing private interests coexist. It is precisely because individuals who are independent of one another assert themselves in their own will, and because on this basis their attitude to one another is bound to be egotistical, that self-denial is made necessary in law and right. In contract, I hold property on the strength of a common will, that is to say, it is the interest of reason that subjective will should become universal and raise itself to this degree of actualization. In other words, the individual will becomes universal through legal relations, but this universality first appears only as a common will. The subjective will should become universal will, but it initially becomes so only as common will. The contract is therefore much more than an agreement, but the social form in which universality appears. The contract demonstrates an immanent universality precisely as the indistinguishability of two wills. In exchange, A and B are different people, yet as property owners, they become identical. The legal relation is what creates a universal identity, where the participants do not consciously create this universality. When Marx announced that he was developing his critique as science in the German sense, he was referring to the genetic development of the money form and other categories of political economy that was modeled on Hegel's logic. Hegel is who discovered how forms of universality emerge. Marx is who applied this to capitalism, as money, law, value, capital are forms of objective social universality. This stands in contrast to Habermas's model of universality, coming from Discourse. Discourse ought to constitute this moment in universality and unity, but how can this be, since legal form already shows this constitution prior to all discourse? Universality cannot therefore explain communication, as legal forms already exhibit universality before anybody even reflects upon them and attempts to communicate. The task is therefore not to derive universality from discourse, but to explain how social relations produce forms that are already universal themselves. Okay, and just to break that down even further, so 1. Individuals pursue private interests. 2. Those interests depend on shared social conditions. 3. Exchange relations generate universal forms. 4. Contract is one such form. 5. Law develops out of these forms. 6. These forms are not consciously designed. 7. They arise through social practice. 8. They confront individuals as objective powers. 9. Philosophy must explain their genesis. Habermas merely reconstructs the rational content after the fact. He doesn't deal with any of these 9 steps.